Hi, welcome to In Tune with Dr. Isha. Today's episode is about empowering our kids. I think this is so important right now. This topic is very important to me. And here to discuss our topic today is Coach Matt Burke. He has worked with athletes for the past 20 years. He's coached football, basketball, tennis. He's been a certified personal trainer, and he's also a certified life coach. So he's going to give us some great insight on this topic. Welcome to the show, Coach Matt.
Thank you so much. What a great intro.
Thank you. Well, I'm so excited that you're here because I feel like you have a lot of good information for us. I think many of us as parents, we struggle with how to kind of push our kids and still be an emotional safe space for them. But we see that they're navigating a world that's so different than the world we grew up in. And I think we just could use some guidance and maybe learn from your experiences.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a fine line between when to push and when to back off. But especially in sports, I think that how you navigate that is so important because you can build a lot of strength and resilience through sports and training, both physically and mentally. And I think it can have such a big impact on a kid's life, giving them something to work for, work towards, and help them feel like they're good at something.
That's so true. I really do think confidence comes from doing things and kind of navigating your failures and learning that you can succeed and figuring out how to do that. And I think that's what helps us build our confidence over time.
Mm-hmm.
And, many of us parents who have heard about gentle parenting and, ways to kind of validate our kids' emotional needs, I think that's so important. But I think sometimes that missing link is then taking that next step and helping them feel empowered. So it's like we want to validate their emotions. We want to create that safety for them, but we also want them to know that we believe in them, and we want to kind of give them that push that's going to help them really move forward in the world. And I
Sure.
think things like sports and what you do can really help with that.
Well, and I definitely think like having help, like having a coach that can be that, balance of that tough love, so that at home, you can be more of, the caregiver and the gentle parenting, like you said. So having that person that is maybe outside of their family that is so important, because it's like, it means so much when someone cares about you and you don't feel like they're supposed to or they're obligated to, like your family, your parents, whatever. And I think that can have such a big impact, like someone that believes in you. I think about like when I was a kid, and my mom would tell me that I'm handsome, and I'm like, whatever, mom, like you're supposed to say that, like you're biased, you created me. But then, you go out and you go to school, whatever, and someone says, oh, you look handsome. And you're like, really?
It means something different.
Yeah, you start to believe it,
That's a good point. Well, so how do you know when to really push somebody or kind of let them have a day where, they're not being as challenged as much?
Yeah, I definitely think it's unique to every individual, and you the more you learn about them and understand about them, I think the easier it is to kind of navigate like what they need, even from day to day, because it could change the next day, just depending on what else is going on in their lives and everything. So I definitely think it's a feeling. I think being empathetic, helps a lot.
Sure.
To be able to like understand what it's easy to look on the surface and be like, oh, this kid's like acting out, or they're not listening today. And then it's another thing to like, kind of try to figure out like what's going on with them, and try to figure out how best to help them that day or in that moment. And sometimes I think it's interesting because sometimes they just want someone to listen,
Right.
and I've noticed that you get so caught up in the coaching world of being like, you're supposed to have the answers and you're supposed to tell them what to do and be in charge. And a lot of the time, when you take a step back and you just allow them to talk, that's really what they needed in the moment. And then they're able to work through their stuff
Yeah.
just by having someone to listen.
You brought up a couple of really good points. One being that you never know what somebody is going through,
Mm-hmm.
and how they show up may reflect a lot more that's under the surface. And I think it's really good for us to be sensitive of that, aware of that. As any caring, adult in a child's life, we need to be sensitive to that. And I also like how you individualize your coaching and your recommendations. And I think that's something that's so important. We can't really try to fit everybody into a box.
Mm-hmm.
We have to honor who they are. And that's something that I've admired about your coaching style, that you've always just kind of adapted it to a person's needs. And I think that's so important.
Well, and I've never been a big fan of the one size fits all style of coaching, and I think there's a lot of generic practices that kind of, it makes it to where you can write a kid off. Like maybe if what you're teaching isn't working, then that could lead to be like, oh, well, they just can't do it because they're just not getting it. Instead of being like, okay, let me try and explain it a different way. Let me try it this way. And I think being creative helps a lot with that. And I love being creative with the creative process.
Yeah.
And it's so fun, like finding new ways to teach something that you've taught a certain way for a while that's worked, and then coming up with a new approach. And it keeps it fresh for me as a coach. It keeps it fresh for students. You're like trying new stuff. You're not doing like the same thing over and over again, because that can get old. And even though the best players in the world that master the details first, the basic stuff that people think is, for kids, it's like they work on the basic stuff all the time.
Sure. Well, and the foundation is important too, but then to really get yourself to that higher level, you have to think outside the box on how to bring that out in someone.
Well, and I think that's why coaching is so important, because I think that, you could probably talk to any professional athlete and there was some coach that they had that helped them along the way get to where they are.
True.
And that it's so special having someone that believes in you, and cares about you and wants to see you succeed and pours into you.
Yes.
And that's, nobody gets there on their own, right?
And I think that can truly shape a child's life. There's actually numerous studies on kids who have gone through adversity, and when they track along their lives and they find, the kids who experienced adverse events but then ended up being successful and having very fulfilling lives, what was a key component of their childhood that maybe shaped them that way. And those kids tended to have an adult in their lives, as you described, who believed in them and who kind of pushed and motivated them and helped them kind of step into that success. And I think that's really, really important.
For sure. Yeah, and I think, it could be an escape too, but in a positive way, because I think that there's lots of different ways that kids try to escape, from whatever is going on in their lives, from no matter how small or how big, it might seem to us, in our experience, to them, it's, the most important thing that's happening to them, or the biggest thing that's ever happened to them, the most, devastating thing that's ever happened to them, no matter what it is. And I think sports are such a good constructive escape. You're able to like go focus on something, I think not just for the physical aspect, because I think the physical health goes such a long way in kids and being active, and just getting out and moving around, because, I think kids, it's so important for them to be active, and not just sit. And that's what I think the difference is now, like you were talking about the struggles of today's generation is they have so much access to technology.
They do.
They have so many different options for things that they can do, you know, like shows, games, whatever. Whereas back in the day, you know, that makes me sound old. Back in the day, you know, back in my day, you know, it's like you only had whatever show was on, you know, and like if you didn't want to watch that show, you went and did something else. You know, you went outside and played, but
And you had to get creative
yeah,
what to do with your
hmm
time.
use your imagination. Yeah,
Exactly. And I think kids now, I mean, they can be engaged in the activity that they're doing, whatever screen time activity that they're doing, but it really doesn't establish connection. And I think that's something that as parents and adults who, you know, care about the kids in their lives, we have to focus on building connection. I think we have to work a little bit harder to build that connection.
hmm
And having a coach or doing a sport, whether it's team-based or individual, it can still create that connection.
for sure. I mean, and that's what connection is so important, like you're saying about in all aspects of life. And you know, it's like people don't care what you know until they know that you care, right?
Right.
So it's like once you have that bond, then it's like then they're a lot more receptive to criticism, to construction, you know, to build them up, to make you know. And I've noticed that like structure, you know, sometimes like kids crave structure,
They do.
you know, even though they might, you know, resist it at first. It's like when you put like established rules, they're a lot more likely to follow through with them, and almost like I've seen that they almost police themselves,
Right.
you know, like they hold themselves accountable.
And that's very powerful. I've noticed that, you know, working with kids and families in my experience, you know, one, that kids crave connection and they also crave a framework to live their lives in. You know, that's part of being a kid is you are trying to learn the boundaries of the world. And how else do you do that? But by either kind of testing the boundaries or feeling more secure when someone kind of defines them for you. I think that's so important. And I like that you mentioned, you know, you really have to get their trust first. They have to know that you care. They have to know that you're in it for them and not against them. And I think that's very, very important.
Yeah, especially with kids that are struggling, you know, and having trouble, you know, with whatever it is, with school or whatever, that like knowing that you care, you know, I think that goes a long way.
Yes. And I do worry about the emotional resiliency of this generation of kids as a whole because of just the product of the world that they grow up in. But I do think that one way to build that is by going out and doing things, whether it's sports or other activities or, you know, having that opportunity to be bored and come up with a way to entertain themselves, but kind of discovering things about themselves and discovering their strengths and proving to themselves that they're capable. That is, I think, one of the keys. And I think it's one thing if an adult, you know, that you care about, that you trust, tells you they believe in you, but when someone believes in you and then you prove it to yourself that you can do it and you believe in you, that's what changes their trajectory sometimes.
Yeah, confidence comes from demonstrated performance, right? Like,
And demonstrating it to yourself.
yes, and one of my favorite things about coaching is when a kid does something that they didn't know that they could do. Like the look on their face and they're shocked and I'm shocked and we're just looking at each other and then they start smiling. They're like, I didn't know I could do that, you know?
That's a moment.
It's that's huge moment. And that like leads to, you know, other types of growth and be like, oh,
That's true.
what else can I do that I didn't know I could do, you know? And like just inspiring yourself, right? Like, but that's one of my favorite things. Like they have that moment and you're just like, yes, you know, like you did it. And they're like, I did it, you know, like I didn't.
Like they're just as surprised, or if not more surprised.
We're both surprised and excited, and it's but that's what I mean. Like, and I think that's like it's so like impactful, that connection and having someone who's like genuinely excited for you, you know, like they're sharing that excitement with you. And I think that's like one of the things about coaching that's so important is like you're sharing in that excitement. You know, I think about like one of the first um, consistent kids that I started teaching tennis, and I took that very seriously, you know, and I really tried to pour everything I could into helping him, you know, because he was like my first, you know, my first consistent kid, and I really cared about his success. And I remember, you know, going through the ups and downs and seeing him win his first tournament and sharing that like joy with him and his family. And like, you know, we just all like, he like dropped to his knees because he would cry. He's so emotional. We were emotional. I were like jumping around, and like I felt like that was even more special to me than anything that I've won myself, you know, trophies or whatever, like matches, tournaments. I feel like seeing him win was like I helped him,
Yeah,
you know, reach his goal.
absolutely. That's very fulfilling.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do think it's so important sometimes to challenge kids and kind of hold them to a higher expectation. You know, we want to be gentle in some ways, but in other ways, we want to give them high standards so that they know we believe in them. And I think that's really powerful as a coach. You know, you setting the next goal for them, you kind of pushing them to this place where they're like, I don't think I can do that, coach. You know, when they show themselves that they can do it, that really elevates them. And I think, you know, that's them knowing that you believed in them and then proving to themselves that they can believe in themselves too. I think those moments really build and they, you know, help our kids grow and succeed over time. And then they have those big moments where they may win a tournament and kind of get to experience that feeling. But whether you win or lose the tournament, if you've had those moments where you've just built yourself up by proving to yourself that you're capable, I think that in itself is just life-changing sometimes.
Yeah, it can carry over into all aspects of life for sure. And not being afraid to fail, you know, that's a big thing.
Huge thing.
And I think that goes along with these common like limiting beliefs that we all have, you know, like in our day to day that we might not even really acknowledge.
What are some examples of common limiting beliefs?
Well, I feel like I hear all the time, like, oh, I'm not good at that, or I can't do that, or
Well, we tell these things to ourselves every day.
I've caught myself doing it, you know, just having, and I'm like, why am I telling myself this? You know, why am I telling myself that I can't do this or I can't get better at this? You know, and I feel like it's a lot easier to tell someone else, you know, like to give advice rather than take your own. But I think that there's a lot of almost like a defense mechanism, you know, of in your mind of being like holding yourself back, you know, and saying like, oh, well, I'm not good at this, or I'm not good at that, or I've never been good at this. And you keep telling yourself, you know, that you're not good at something, you believe it. It's like you shape your own reality, you know?
So how do we get past these limiting beliefs?
Well, I think recognizing them first is a big thing for me personally, that you can change how you approach any situation just by focusing on what you can do, you know, thinking about I can do this. And you know, it's easy to say like just believe in yourself, right? Like
Right.
like you know, just think you can, you know, and then you'll be able to do it. And it's like that's not necessarily the case, but
Not that easy.
no, but it definitely gives you a better chance of succeeding rather than if you tell yourself you can't, then you're right.
Well, you have to take the first step somewhere. And often that first step is the hardest. Just deciding, well, maybe I can, and maybe I will commit myself to this. And then those other pieces kind of fall into place as you proceed with your goal. Yeah.
Yeah, the first step, I mean, it's getting started is one of the hardest things.
It is.
And then, I mean, it's like anything, like they talk about like New Year's and, you know, your resolutions and all that, and how people like 2 weeks in, like stop going to the gym,
Right.
you know. But I also think it's like having a plan, like it's going to the gym or getting in shape. It's
So
vague.
vague.
It's vague. So having a set plan to hold yourself accountable and having a routine, almost like creating a routine that will help you to be more consistent and follow through with what you're trying to achieve, rather than having the common like vague goals like get in shape or stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, and I think when we take those steps for ourselves, our kids are watching. We can help empower them by modeling it for them.
Be the example. Yeah.
Yep. So you've worked with people of all ages for 20 years. You've helped to build them up. You've helped them succeed. What are some tips that we as parents can really work on at home to kind of support that process?
Well, I think interacting for sure. That's an easy one. And growing up when I was a kid, I know that like the thing that meant the most to me was playing together.
So important. It's like a lost art, I think.
It was something I looked forward to so much was, my dad coming out to shoot hoops with me or, playing games as a family.
So much through play.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that extra interaction at home goes a long way. And I mean, just by playing, kids are so fascinating because it's amazing how quickly they pick things up sometimes, and just by doing, just by playing at home, it's easy to get caught up in just like, okay, I'm going to play at practice or I'm going to go to practice. And then when I get home, I'm just going to relax or whatever, or play games or whatever else they're interested in. But I think that consistency of playing at home, whatever they're interested in, and it doesn't have to be a sport. It could be chess. It could be something
whatever their child is interested in.
Mentally stimulating. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that creates connection.
Yeah.
And I think that goes a long way. Often as adults, we're so busy with our lives that we kind of don't look at play as an important learning tool for our kids, but it's one of the most important learning tools, and it helps them learn about themselves and it helps create that bond. So I love that tip. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. That was such wonderful insight on how we can empower kids and help support them. And we really appreciate everything that you do.
Well, thank you for having me. And I think it's really special what you're doing. I think giving people a voice, inspiring them, that's what we do, right?
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll see you guys next time on the next episode of In Tune with Dr. Isha.